Last time on Clash of Kings, we saw how the birth of Jesus was a declaration of war against the Roman Empire. But it went far beyond the Roman emperor. It was a declaration of war that still echoes today. We heard the first battle cry in the song of a teenage girl who declared that her son would topple rulers from their thrones.
But Mary's courageous yes created an immediate crisis. It placed the entire divine plan in the hands of one man.
A righteous man facing an impossible choice. A devout carpenter who discovered his fiancée was pregnant, and the child was not his. This is the part of the Christmas story we often clean up. It's a story of potential scandal, public shame, and a quiet, agonizing decision made in the dark of night.
Joseph, on the other hand, has to account for two different expectations. He has the pressures and demands of the Mosaic laws, the laws of what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, of Deuteronomy more specifically, to abide by laws, for example, of Deuteronomy 22, which says that if someone is caught in the act of adultery, that person can be not only condemned, that person and the person with whom they are committing adultery can be stoned to death or can be put to death in some way. So that's one of the Mosaic laws that Joseph is now having the pressure to abide by. The second one is Deuteronomy 24 that says that if there is a suspicion that the person to whom you are betrothed or engaged has done something wrong, then you have the right to request either an annulment of that engagement or to end a marriage.
Welcome back to Rethink. I'm Tiffany, your host. In the Clash of Kings moves from a public song to the realm of dreams. We're not in the halls of Roman power, but in the bedroom of Joseph of Nazareth after a long day of work in his carpentry shop. Joseph was caught between two non-negotiable laws. The law of his people, which demanded justice, and a new command from God, which demanded a radical, reputation-destroying faith. His choice, a courageous act of obedience, was just as revolutionary as Mary's song. He would become the silent guardian of a king, the first man to pledge allegiance not to a Caesar he could see in statues everywhere, but to the Savior no one yet knew.
Here in Priene, archaeologists have unearthed the proof carved in stone. In 9 BC, a decree was found proposing to change the calendar to honor the emperor.
And its language is one of the most important historical discoveries for understanding the New Testament. It read, "The birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of the good tidings for the world that came by reason of him. From his birth, a new reckoning of time must begin." To understand the difference between the gospel of Caesar and the gospel of Jesus, we need to meet the man who had to live it. That man was a carpenter from Nazareth named Joseph, Mary's fiancé.
These were the very roads that carried Caesar's power across the empire, but God used them to challenge the official narrative of the Roman Empire. Rome's vast power often echoed from the distant capital all the way here to Judea. Caesar's commands, signed with a flick of the wrist in a marble palace in Rome, were the desires of a god. Laws and decrees, whims and wishes of emperors and hallways of gold reached the empire by the fastest horses available. Joseph's world, on the other hand, wasn't made of marble and gold. It was made of sawdust and heavy, rough timber. You see, to him, the Roman Empire was an intrusion. It was an oppressive, colonizing power that surfaced now and again as screams in the street that often interrupted his work at the shop. Often, the empire threatened his life and that of those he loved.
In the ancient world, kings disrupted things. And it was no different when Jesus came. Jesus disrupted the lives of Mary and Joseph. When Mary found out she was pregnant, a teenager, think about what that must have meant for her family. When Joseph found out that this young woman that he was engaged to, that he was supposed to marry, was pregnant, think about what that meant for his family. Think about what that might have meant for both their reputations. It was disruptive. There's no doubt about it. And they had to make a choice. They had to make a decision what they were going to do.
The clash of kings, Caesar and God, was not a theory. It was a story of his life.
The clash of kings, Caesar, and God was not a theory, it was the story of his life. But Joseph also had other concerns. The immediate kingdom dictated his life, his local community, governed by two powerful forces, the law of Moses and the unwritten code of honor and shame of the Hebrews.
The other demand that Joseph is suffering pressure from are the social demands. And the social demands are similar to the demands that Mary had over her, which are of honor. And honor is given due to a good reputation. Now, if Joseph accepts Mary as his wife, given the fact that she has become impregnated before the marriage, he is also now at risk of losing the honor that he has and of his whole family. So Joseph is also risking the honor of his reputation and of his whole family.
You see, recently his world had been turned upside down. His fiancée Mary had told him she was pregnant and he knew he wasn't the father. By law and custom, he had every right to expose her to public shame, to protect his honor. His first instinct, born of a kind heart, was to simply end it quietly. But then, an angel came to him in a dream and asked him to believe the unbelievable, that this child was from God, and that he, Joseph, was to be his earthly father. He was asked to choose between his reputation, his lineage, and his God. And he chose God. He chose to bear the whispers, the sideways glances, and the public disgrace, to protect this young woman and the impossible promise she carried. He chose obedience over honor, faith over fear.
See, the law was clear. Deuteronomy 22 prescribed a brutal punishment for adultery, death by stoning. While Jews were afraid of applying the death penalty without Roman approval, the social consequences was just as final. A woman accused of such a thing brought deep, irreversible shame upon her entire family. So Joseph had a lot to lose. He wasn't just a devout Jew, he was a respected pillar in his community. To marry a woman carrying another man's child would have been social suicide. He would have been seen as weak, a fool, and complicit in a grave sin. This was the world pressing in on Joseph. Not only were Caesar's capricious decrees brought by swift horses and imposed by the sword in first century Judea, but the whispers of neighbors and friends would sting worse than the threats of the occupiers. This was not a judgment of a distant emperor, but the judgment of the elders at the city gate. Every part of his culture, his faith, and his Hebrew identity screamed at him to protect his honor and uphold the law. His most righteous, logical path was to end this engagement. And Matthew's gospel tells us that's exactly what he planned to do. Rome's gospel was one of absolute power and compliance. But Joseph's community had its own demands, which often overruled one's freedom of choice.
When I think about Joseph and Mary and that decision that they made, a disruptive decision that would change their lives forever, I think about that in my own life. And when we choose Jesus, it disrupts our lives too. But I think when we look back on it, just as Mary and Joseph look back on it, they would have made that choice every time, because they realized what that choosing that king meant for their lives, what that Lord meant for their lives. And I think it goes for us as well.
So on one side, you have the visible established world with its clear rules, and then on the other, a divine intervention that breaks every single one of them. Matthew tells us, because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her. Joseph was faced with an impossible choice: the world's logic, the fear of disgrace, the loss of his reputation, all of this on one side. And on the other was a whisper from God, a call to a path of radical faith. But then God intervened with his own gospel, not a decree, but a dream. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." The angel asked Joseph to believe the unbelievable, that this child was the Son of God, and that he, a simple carpenter, was to be his guardian.
That dream once again upended Joseph's life. Let's consider the gravity of what was being asked of him. It wasn't just a difficult task. He had to deal with difficult tasks and people in the shop constantly. This was a demand to dismantle his entire identity. The angel had asked him to sacrifice the one thing a man in his culture could not afford to lose: his reputation. In a small, tight-knit community like Nazareth, reputation wasn't about ego, it was about survival. It was the currency of trust that brought him work as a craftsman. It was a foundation of respect that gave him a voice among the elders. It was his legacy. To lose it was to become a ghost in his own village.
See, Joseph was also being asked to believe a biological impossibility, to accept a story that defied reason and experience. And based on that impossible story, he had to choose allegiance to an unseen plan over the tangible honor of his community. Now, this command wasn't just marry this girl. It was publicly claim this child as your own. It was absorb all the shame that comes with it. It was endure the knowing glances, the hearsay, and the whispers behind your back, the questions about your own piety. His choice was not a simple one between, good and evil. It was a complex, agonizing choice between two different definitions of what it meant to be a righteous man. The first definition was public and legal. It meant upholding the law of Moses, protecting the honor of his family name, and doing what the entire community would recognize as just and right. By that standard, divorcing Mary was the best option. Just divorcing her quietly was the peak of compassionate righteousness.
But the dream presented another definition of righteousness: obedience to a direct command from God, no matter the cost. This righteousness wasn't performed for the approval of the village. It was an act of trust deep in his heart. He had to decide which court he would answer to, the court of public opinion or the court of heaven. The dream didn't erase the consequences, it only clarified the choice. And in the silence of his own home, after the angel was gone and the morning light brought back the cold, hard reality of his situation, Joseph chose God. To trust the dream and to obey the God of promises over the emperor of decrees. He chose the baby's gospel, and that choice put him on this road, walking into the center of God's plan. He chose faith over fear, and his quiet obedience became the second pillar necessary to support this new kingdom.
In Caesarea, a city built by Herod to honor Caesar, we see the power of the Roman gospel on full display. Power here meant decrees, stones, legions, and public declarations. It meant enslaving people to build the emperor's grand vision of an eternal kingdom. Rome's power was absolute, and it demanded absolute compliance. Here again, Joseph is implicated in this clash of kings. We read in Luke 2, verses 1 to 5. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. Caesar's decree was more than an imperial command. It was the final test in a crisis of faith that had already pushed him to the brink. When Caesar issued his census decree in Rome at the turn of the first millennium, Joseph had no choice but to obey. He and Mary were forced onto the road to Bethlehem by this worldly authority.
For Joseph, this imperial command was just the final chapter in a much deeper crisis of faith. The journey was going to be difficult. The roads were filled with robbers and dangers. There was no guarantee of a place to sleep once they arrived in Bethlehem. If he were alone, that would have been no problem. Sleeping out in the open would not have been hard for a man whose back had been toughened by hard work. But he was no longer alone. Mary was pregnant, and the baby was due at any time. This journey commanded by Caesar was only happening because Joseph had first obeyed a completely different kind of power, a power that came in a dream. Let's contrast these two commands. Caesar's decree was public, shouted to the world. God's dream was private and whispered to one man. Caesar's decree was enforced by fear of punishment, and God's dream required faith in a promise. Caesar's decree demanded Joseph's taxes. God's dream demanded Joseph's entire life and reputation.
Joseph's story forces us to rethink what faithfulness looks like. Mary's faith was expressed in her acceptance of the world's most important mission. Her loyalty and trust in God rose a magnificent, world-changing song,
a prophetic declaration broadcast for all to hear.
Joseph expressed his faith in God quietly, in the battles no one sees. He didn't write a song for others to sing and tell his story. He pressed on with the wedding plans. He picked up his tools and went to work. He finished the bed he had planned as Mary's wedding gift. He built the table and the chairs where his new family would gather for meals. He built the crib where the baby would sleep. He married the love of his life, but waited until she had the baby to consummate the marriage. Joseph didn't make a grand proclamation. His faith was found in the mundane, courageous acts of providing, protecting, and persevering. He was a silent guardian, building a shield of normalcy around a supernatural reality. His hands, calloused from hard labor, became the protectors of the hands that would one day bear the scars of crucifixion. Mary's faith gave the Son of God a womb. Joseph's faith gave him a home and a name.
When the baby was finally delivered in a cattle stall in Bethlehem, new characters are introduced into the plot.
In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." Unbeknownst to Joseph, the clash of kings that had upended his life had reached distant lands and invited legendary men of the East to witness the birth of a king. But it would soon upend the lives of faithful women in Bethlehem.
Herod, the emperor's puppet governor in Judea, seeking to squash this new king threatening Rome's dominance, orders the killing of all children in and around Bethlehem. This clash of kings had been prophesied by Jeremiah 600 years earlier. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children, she refused to be consoled because they are no more. The ancient village of Bethlehem had just become a divine visitation, but it also became the stage of one of antiquity's most heinous crimes. Here in this village, Rome's sword swung violently to keep its absolute power. When the wonder of the Magi's visit evaporates and danger threatens Joseph's family, he receives a chilling, urgent command.
One of the disruptions was, of course, they had to flee because the king, Herod, wanted to kill the newborn babe who was identified as the new king of the Jews. And he was afraid there was a usurper coming along. So suddenly they had to flee, and they did, all the way down into Africa, where I'm from. They fled to Egypt. Of course, besides fleeing to Egypt, there were the other disruptions that came as we study the lives of these Bible characters. Jesus was constantly out there ministering to people, and at times even his own family didn't quite understand him. Mary and her brothers came to try to stop him, to slow him down, to at least make sure he was okay, apparently, at one stage. And Jesus said, no, my mother and my brothers and my sisters are the people who hear the word of God. And Jesus was also willing to sacrifice.
When they, the Magi, had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. This was the third time Joseph's life had been upended, the second time by a dream. But this time it was different. There was no time to plan, no time to sell his carpentry business or to say goodbye, so he got up during the night. Joseph's obedience is instantaneous and unflinching. He sacrifices his home, his livelihood, and his homeland to fulfill his God-given mission. The clash of kings is stark. Herod's response to a rival is a decree of death, a brutal public display of force designed to eliminate any threat. God's power preempts Herod's insane fury through the quiet obedience of an earthly father. Joseph's simple, faithful act of protecting his family becomes the instrument through which God's plan of redemption is set in motion.
We saw the Clash of Kings move from a prophetic song to a protector's choice. See, Joseph's story reminds us that some of the greatest acts of faith don't receive public applause. They are the quiet decisions to protect, to provide, and to obey, even at great personal cost. They are the moments we absorb a measure of the world's shame to be faithful to a heavenly calling. It's choosing allegiance to God's kingdom in the small, unseen corners of lives. That is the way of the silent guardian. In the Clash of Kings, Joseph sided with the right one. While the Roman Empire proclaimed its gospel with stone monuments and imperial force, God's kingdom advanced through the quiet obedience of a carpenter who chose to believe a dream. Joseph's decision to take Mary as his wife and become the legal father of Jesus was not a footnote to the story. It was the selfless act that shielded the revolution. He shows us that allegiance to the true king isn't always loud, and sometimes it's the strength to stand by a promise when the world calls you a fool. Sometimes it's the courage to walk a difficult road, not because an emperor demands it, but because God has asked you of it. We all face our own clash of kings, and often it's not a grand public stand, but a quiet, personal decision that defines our true allegiance. It's the choice of integrity when dishonesty offers an easier path. It's the manager who refuses to adjust the numbers at the end of the quarter, knowing it might cost him his bonus or even his job. It's the student who accepts a lower grade rather than plagiarizing a paper. See, no one throws a parade for this kind of integrity. It's a lonely, silent choice. It's the choice to trust God's plan when our own plans have fallen apart and we risk looking like a fool. It's starting a ministry, adopting a child, or changing careers in response to a divine whisper, even when the world's logic screams that it's irresponsible and destined to fail. Next time on Clash of Kings, Mary pays a visit to a relative who is also pregnant.
We dream of kingdoms all made of gold, but a wooden cradle made love known.
We chase the crowns we'll never claim, but hope was born when a baby came.
Between a throne and a manger, we kneel and whispered plead. We dreamed of stars and the star drew near. A humble child, the King of Kings.
We
of stars, and the star drew